In the northwestern region of Canada, there was a small town called York, with beautiful surroundings and surrounded by high mountains, and a clear river flowed quietly through the town. By the river stood a wooden house owned by a woman named Jenny, who was in her 50s and lived alone. One day, Mrs. Jenny got busy early in the morning. She trimmed the lawn in front of the house, cleaned the house, and even changed the tablecloth on the dining table. Finally, she put a fragrant bouquet of carnations in the vase on the dining table. It turned out that it was John's birthday, Mrs. Jenny's son. However, despite Mrs. Jenny's plans to prepare a sumptuous birthday dinner, she knew that John would not attend this dinner and never would. Mrs. Jenny was not from this town. Her hometown was a small town called San Antonio in the distant western United States. Over a decade ago, her son John went out at night and never returned. The next morning, someone found him dead in a remote alley. Mrs. Jenny still couldn't forget the tragic scene of her son's death, his face covered in blood, one arm missing, a large hole in his stomach, and his intestines spilling out. After John's death, Mrs. Jenny was heartbroken. So she left her hometown, traveled around, and finally settled in this remote town where she had lived for 10 years. Even though John was no longer with her, every year on his birthday, Mrs. Jenny couldn't help but, just like before, carefully prepare a few of his favorite dishes from when he was alive. And now, she sat alone on the sofa, staring at the photos hanging on the wall, reminiscing about the sweet memories. In the photo, John's thick eyebrows, clear eyes, youthful face, and radiant smile were so endearing. But who could have predicted that on that dark night, his life would be forever frozen at 18? Just as Mrs. Jenny was shedding tears of sorrow, suddenly there was a voice outside calling her name. "Mrs. Jenny, are you home?" Mrs. Jenny responded and went to the door, where she saw a middle-aged stranger standing outside. The woman introduced herself as Annie, coming from the small town of San Antonio, USA, to deliver a notification to Mrs. Jenny. After speaking, Annie opened her bag and took out an envelope. Mrs. Jenny took the envelope, opened it, and was stunned. It was a notification letter sent from the San Antonio prison, stating that the murderer of her son, Blair, had recently been sentenced to death by the High Court and would be executed on October 25th. The letter also indicated that as a victim's family member, Mrs. Jenny would have the right to witness the entire process of Blair's execution. Mrs. Jenny held the notification letter, her hands trembling. This just judgment. She had been waiting for over a decade. She never expected it to come on John's birthday. For the deceased John, this was an incredibly precious birthday gift. Annie said, "Mrs. Jenny, Blair killed your son, John, causing you endless pain. Witnessing his execution is your legal right. Of course, if you feel uncomfortable, you can choose not to attend." Mrs. Jenny carefully put away the letter and firmly said, "I'm going, of course. I've been waiting for 10 years just for this day to come." Annie nodded and invited Mrs. Jenny to take the flight back to San Antonio with her tomorrow. However, Mrs. Jenny shook her head and refused. She said she wanted to drive there herself. Annie was stunned. It was over 2,500 miles from here to San Antonio, such a long distance. Why would Mrs. Jenny give up the flight? At this moment, Mrs. Jenny walked into the room holding a photo frame, tears streaming down her face as she said, "The reason is simple. I want to accompany John back and witness this moment of revenge. But John has a fear of heights and can't take a plane. When he was alive, he always found train rides too rigid. So I decided to drive back, taking him to see the scenery along the way." Annie sighed silently. Although it was just a photo frame in Mrs. Jenny's eyes, it was still the same as the living John, needing her care and protection. She wanted to send John home in the way he liked, to witness that moment of revenge. So they agreed to set off separately and meet in San Antonio. Before leaving, Annie repeatedly reminded Mrs. Jenny to drive safely and be careful on the journey. Mrs. Jenny had her car checked, and on a sunny morning, with John's photo frame, she began this long journey. Making stops along the way, the journey went smoothly, and 4 days later, Mrs. Jenny entered the state of Montana in the United States. Montana is the 4th largest state in the United States, with highlands, deep valleys, and a sparse population throughout. Mrs. Jenny had intended to cover more ground, but she ended up missing the opportunity to find accommodation. As night fell, the road was surrounded by endless dense forests. Tired and sleepy, Mrs. Jenny could only continue driving, hoping to find a place to stay for the night. As she drove on, Mrs. Jenny felt a moment of dizziness, but it was too late. The car had already veered off the road, crashing heavily into a tree. Mrs. Jenny's head hit the windshield hard. Her vision darkened and she passed out. When she woke up, she found herself lying in bed, surrounded by snow-white walls. And at that moment, a hand reached out and gently pressed her shoulder. "Are you awake?" "Thank God." "You're okay." Mrs. Jenny looked up to see a woman in her 60s with a thin face looking kindly at her. It turned out that this woman was named Mary. She was passing by when she noticed Mrs. Jenny had been in a car accident. Mary quickly called for help and followed her to the hospital, staying by Mrs. Jenny's side all night. Fortunately, Mrs. Jenny's injuries were not severe, and she was able to leave the hospital the next day. However, her car would take at least half a month to repair. Mrs. Jenny couldn't wait that long. After careful consideration, she decided to take John's photo frame and head to the nearby train station. When Mary heard of Mrs. Jenny's plan to leave, she was surprised and said, "Your injuries haven't fully healed. How can you leave so quickly? You must come to my house to rest for a few days before making any plans." Mrs. Jenny sighed and told Mary about the purpose of her trip. After hearing her, Mary remained silent for a long time and said, "So you drove all the way from Canada to San Antonio to take your son's photo frame back and witness the execution of the murderer?" Mrs. Jenny nodded. Mary fell silent again and then said, "All right, I'll drive and accompany you to San Antonio." Mrs. Jenny was shocked. The journey from Montana to San Antonio was about 2,000 kilometers. Why did Mary want to accompany her on such a long trip? Mary let out a sigh, and 2 tears rolled down her cheeks. The reason is simple. Actually, my son was also killed by that murderer, Blair. A few days ago, Anne from the Federal High Court sent me a related notice. I didn't want to go, but now that I've met you, I've decided to accompany you no matter what. It turned out that Blair had committed a series of murders, and he had killed as many as 5 victims. For this execution, the Federal High Court sent notification letters to the family members of each victim. Mrs. Jenny never expected that she would encounter another mother with a similar experience on her way to Blair's execution. What's more, this mother had also saved her life. Looking at the sorrowful Mary, Mrs. Jenny took her hand and said, "All right, let's hit the road together and witness that moment of retribution." And so Mary drove, and Mrs. Jenny joined her on the road. Along the way, they shared various childhood stories about their sons. 5 days later, they finally arrived in San Antonio. In the prison reception room, they met Anne. Anne greeted Mrs. Jenny and then turned to Mary, saying, "Mrs. Mary, as Blair's mother, I'm glad that you, as a relative of the prisoner, have come to attend this execution." What? Mrs. Jenny was shocked. Mary was actually Blair's mother. How is that possible? At that moment, Mary turned to her. "I'm sorry. Now I guess you must feel like I've lied to you. But I never wanted to deliberately hide anything. I just didn't have the right opportunity to explain to you. As a mother, I really don't have the courage to witness my child being executed in front of me. So when Anne sent the notification letter, I refused. I drove you here to attend the execution of my son. One is because he killed your son and I am atoning for him. And there's another reason. When I saw you coming from afar to witness this moment, I suddenly worried that at the last moment of his life, he would face the hateful gazes of the victims' families. I hope to add a warm gaze of my own amidst all that hatred. After all, he's my son, and he will also atone for his sins with his own life. By the end, Mary was crying, and Mrs. Jenny couldn't help but shed tears of sadness too. 2 nights later, Blair was about to be executed, and Mary walked into the prisoner's family observation room alone. Mrs. Jenny and several other victims' families also entered the victims' family observation room, all silently waiting for the moment of execution. Finally, the curtain covering the execution room slowly rose, and with tears in her eyes, Mary saw Blair already lying on the execution bed. Through the glass window, Mary could see Mrs. Jenny in the victim's observation room, holding John's picture frame along with other victims' families, quietly waiting. The executioner, with a face mask, connected the injection tube to Blair's arm, and the deadly poison slowly flowed into Blair, who was bound to the execution bed. At that moment, Mary was surprised to see Mrs. Jenny slowly turning away while holding John's picture frame. The other victims' families also followed Mrs. Jenny, and all turned away. Not a single person facing Blair struggling on the execution bed. Mary cried, knowing that she was the only one now watching Blair. Despite Blair's sins, at the last moment of his life, Mrs. Jenny and the other victims' families chose to give him the final respect. Mrs. Jenny, with her back turned, also cried silently. Who would have thought that she had traveled so far just to see Blair die in front of her? But at this last moment, she chose to give up. Not only did she choose to give up herself, but she also persuaded the other victims' families to give up. All of this was because in the other observation room, there stood another great mother. At that moment, Mrs. Jenny sincerely hoped that the other mother could give her son the warmest gaze and provide him with the last bit of comfort.